mental health professionals, we also struggle to fully embrace the service user or the mental health patient identity.
Yeah, I mean, I put in those questions, like something I was really interested to know a little bit more about is just your role. Like, what are you most interested in at the moment with your teaching and other responsibilities, and kind of what gets you motivated at the moment?
Gets me motivated. That's a good question. I'm a mental health nurse lecturer, so I spend a lot of time with pre-registration nursing students, which I absolutely love. I think that's one of the best parts of my job, is supporting students on their own journeys to becoming a mental health nurse. As I live with my own personal experience of mental illness, again, I'm really passionate about trying to remove some of that stigma, particularly attached to mental health nurses or mental health professionals who have their own personal lived experience of mental illness. And I like to encourage students who may also have their own mental health challenges that it doesn't necessarily need to stop them becoming an amazing mental health nurse. So I'm definitely passionate about that. And yeah.
Well, what's your experience of those pre-reg mental health nurses in terms of, I mean, obviously you don't know everything about everyone who you're supporting or teaching or educating, but could you share a little bit about your experience about the perhaps prevalence that you've seen, or what you know from the literature maybe about students coming onto that program in general and having their pre-existing mental ill health?
I think we're definitely seeing it a lot more now that students are motivated to become a mental health nurse because of their own personal experience of being under services, living with a mental illness. That's a real special motivation that people have. They need to be supported with that. It's challenging being a mental health professional with a mental illness. It's incredibly challenging to spend 3 years learning about mental health challenges and mental health nursing when you can relate that to some of your own experiences. And that can be, I find that a challenge sometimes as well. So that can be quite a challenge for students. I think identity is challenging as well. I've had over the last kind of 7-8 years, I've been on a real journey in terms of my identity as both a mental health nurse, but also a mental health service user. And there's been, many challenges along the way, and it's been a real difficult and uncomfortable journey at times. So I'd like to think that I can, help others with that identity, those identity challenges. I was a community mental health nurse on maternity leave, and then I developed quite severe perinatal mental health challenges. Pretty much went from a nurse on maternity leave to a mental health patient virtually overnight. So that was quite traumatic. It was quite a dramatic change, quite traumatic, like I said, but the start of a real complex journey with many, many complex layers to it. I think those ideas of nurse and patient, traditionally were quite different, quite binary, quite opposites, especially in the kind of aftermath of the medical model being so dominant in mental health services. Nurses are viewed as the experts, perhaps viewed as beyond distress, beyond illness. And then we have mental health service users who have a mental illness and need our support. And then, there's often a them and us mentality, if you're familiar with that term. So that's, the nurses are separate, and then we have our mental health service users. So a transition from being a nurse to then becoming a service user, it can be quite a radical role reversal, which can be challenging. When I access services as a mental health service user, less so now, but still to a certain degree, I do feel relatively powerless. I comply, for want of a better word, with treatments and appointments and medications, sometimes out of fear I don't want to be labelled as non-compliant. I don't want to be labelled as a difficult patient. There's definitely that power imbalance between nurses and service users. Reflecting back on my practice when I was a nurse, I didn't realise the true kind of impact of that power imbalance. I probably quite naively, thought I was, did my best to, empower my service users and listen to them and take their views into account, realising that, even with that good nursing care, that power imbalance is really apparent. I think there's also issues around, kind of challenging that nurse-patient divide. We know that the title of a registered mental health nurse doesn't make us immune to mental health challenges. But when we have one of our colleagues who has a severe and enduring mental illness, the idea is it's challenged.
And how have you found that experience with colleagues, Jane, in terms of perceptions? Because this has happened over the past 7 years. You talked about your journey. Have you noticed differences in how you feel you're perceived by colleagues and any of those relationships over that time?
I'd like to think that the stigma is getting less. I really would like to think that. I think when I first went back to work after becoming unwell, I definitely experienced some stigma, or maybe not stigma, but maybe just shock that perhaps I was, openly talking that I'd been unwell whilst I'd been off work. I'd like to think that that's improved. And I do think that has got better, or maybe I've got more confident in talking about my own experiences where I'm, less bothered by other people's perceptions. But I definitely think, there is still stigma attached to a mental health nurse needing to be under mental health services or having a mental health condition, if that answers that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's something about putting people on a bit of a pedestal, isn't there? In healthcare, you do all this training to become this identity. Obviously, I come from a background as a psychologist, and I had this similar kind of experience where you're at university and everyone is trying to be something, and it's like you're becoming something. And even though on the one hand you are learning about and trying to empower people with mental health and destigmatize things, in some sense you're armoring up, and it doesn't feel okay to actually acknowledge how you're really feeling or what's going on for you, because you're meant to be there's this expert role that you mentioned, right?
Yeah, and that's a challenge because if you feel that you can't merge those two identities as nurse and service user, then it creates that internal conflict because you never feel like you can truly be yourself or be authentic.
Yeah.
So when I've accessed services, I've been reluctant to disclose the fact that I'm a mental health nurse, and I received some reactions along the lines of, oh, well, you know better than me, or, oh, well, I don't need to tell you, X, Y, and Z. That was very difficult for me personally, because I just I didn't want to be treated like a nurse. I just want to be treated like a mental health service user. For a long time, I didn't have any insight into my illness and the fact that I was unwell. I couldn't have felt further away from the nurse that I was, 6 months ago. I was in a completely different state. That was quite difficult, whereas I was kind of expected to be able to, almost treat myself or, be my own community mental health nurse. And I was in, absolutely zero position to be able to do that. So, and that's another challenge is when mental health nurses are providing care to other mental health nurses. They might feel intimidated. They might feel, someone said to me, oh, kind of no pressure on me then to do this assessment. Like I was, analysing their assessment skills of me, when at the time I was, incredibly low in mood and really paranoid. So I had absolutely zero capacity to be thinking about their assessment skills. So there is a risk that basics are missed. There's a risk that if you're treating another mental health professional, there's a risk that you assume that, okay, they know what's going on. They're going to tell me if things get worse. They know how to keep themselves safe. They know the importance of medication. And a lot of those basics can be missed. And have quite tragic outcomes sometimes as well. That's another issue as well for mental health nurses who are treating other nurses. But like I was saying about that, that identity, if I was going to mental health services feeling like I wanted to hide the fact that I was a nurse, then again, I can't be authentic. And there's that internal struggle, that internal, battle. What do I say? What do I not say? Are they going to find out I'm a nurse? It's just ridiculous. So you never feel like you can truly be yourself if those different identities are so seismically different. I've also kind of, reflected on and wrote around kind of the concept of, different identities that nurses with mental illness can adopt. So we've got the nurse and the patient, those kind of really archetypal concepts. But then also there's concepts of a wounded healer or an impaired professional. So the wounded healer comes from kind of Greek mythology. And again, it's that archetypal idea of kind of healing and power that comes from, struggles and, personal brokenness and woundedness. And then that's used as a positive to kind of transform that pain and to heal others. But again, that concept is nice in some ways, but still quite limited. Again, there's that judgment to be made of when is somebody well enough to be able to use their struggles to help other people. And again, there's that stigma in the workplace, which again just compounds that secrecy, shame, and that self-stigma. And then there's the option of the impaired professional, which is probably even worse. As an impaired professional, a nurse with their own personal experience of mental illness is almost seen as a liability or a risk to patients, or someone that's going to go off sick, or someone that's going to be unreliable, or someone who's maybe negatively drawing on their own experiences, and that's having an adverse effect on therapeutic relationships with service users. So I think that's impaired professional. It's that's an identity that but we don't want the wounded healer where this magical kind of healing abilities that kind of romanticizes our own struggles and our own pain. There's nothing idyllic and romanticized about living with severe and enduring mental illness. So that kind of nurse, patient, wounded healer, impaired professional, they're all really challenging identities to navigate.
Yeah, I'd heard the term wounded healer before. I actually hadn't heard the impaired professional one, and it's interesting. I kind of considered the appropriateness of that for myself, and challenges that I'd been through. And as you were just describing, in one sense, that felt like it resonated with me. Okay, yeah, I've had my own challenges and I help other people, but as you were kind of alluding to there, I've sort of considered for myself like how helpful it is to just like embody that as I am the wounded healer. Like there are some aspects of it which I don't think are particularly helpful.
Yeah. And again, it's romanticized and
Yeah.
idealistic, and there's nothing idyllic about suffering from mental illness. It couldn't be further, from the reality of it. And I think as well, there's having my own mental illness, or other mental health nurses who've got previous experience, personal experience, it doesn't make you a better nurse than somebody without that experience. It makes you a different nurse, but we're all different people, and we all bring our own different, backgrounds, personalities, histories, experiences to who we are as people. It's definitely not a prerequisite for being a nurse that you've lived with your own mental health challenges. I do believe it doesn't make somebody a better nurse, just makes them a different nurse. I think that's important.
Yeah, there's no perfect set of characteristics or previous experience that makes, well, there just is no perfect nurse, is there? There's no perfect nurse, there's no perfect human being. And it's, yeah, like you said, diversity of experience makes everyone different, and everyone brings something, their own strengths and things to the table, don't they?
Yeah. And then shall I go on to more identity challenges? Because
Yeah, I'd love to hear
that's
more
not
about
enough.
this.
There's a few more layers as
Go for
well.
it.
Um, so again, and this is only my experience of one particular incident, but also that stigma about being a mental health nurse with a mental illness. That's not always limited to the staff room or the staff office. So I've had experiences where I've felt stigmatized by other service users. And again, this was just my own, experience. And I think it was that same internal battle, a kind of peer support, drop-in type setting. And again, it was that battle. Do I tell these other service users that I am also a nurse or also a lecturer? And some points when I I've also then experienced a shift, some stigma as well, which I can understand to a certain degree, but mental health professionals, we also struggle to fully embrace the service user or the mental health patient identity. How can I be, as a nurse with a mental illness, how can I be fully accepted by psychiatric survivor movement, when I've spent the best part of 20 years being part of the problem, for want of a better word? Can I truly be a psychiatric survivor, as a lot of people call themselves, when I educate the workforce, that are almost, compounding this issue, or part of that problem why people identify as a psychiatric survivor. So again, those identity challenges, are there, within those settings as well.
Can I ask a question about that, Jane?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like, you're asking that question, can I be part of the psychiatric survivor? I mean, what is your current thinking or feeling around that? Does it almost sounds like a rhetorical question, but I don't know, where are you sitting with that at the moment?
I think it's definitely a journey, and I'm not there by any
Mm.
means, but for me, it's about authenticity, and kind of attempting the best way I can to embrace, all these different aspects of me, which, could be said for anybody really, and trying to, embrace that authenticity. I am a mental health nurse. I am a mental health lecturer. I'm incredibly proud of being a mental health nurse. I tried to do a different job for a time, but I couldn't do it. I'm a nurse through and through. So went back to nursing. So I am a nurse, and I'm proud of being a mental health nurse. I am a mental health lecturer, and I love my job, and I want to educate and empower students to be the best possible mental health nurses that they can be within a very difficult and broken system. But they can, do and have an amazing impact on people's lives. And I am a mental health service user. I live, with a severe and enduring mental illness. I remain under mental health services. And I'm also a psychiatric survivor, because I've had really difficult experiences of care. I know firsthand how broken the system is, and how, desperately hard, individual nurses are, working within that system. I support my students who are particularly my apprenticeship students who are in the workforce and in incredibly stressful and difficult mental health services. So I know how difficult it is for the nurses, but I also know how difficult it is as a service user. There's elements of the wounded healer, there's elements of, a psychiatric survivor. And for me, it's about, if I try and hide one of those aspects of me, then there's a lot of internal unsettledness, for want of a better word. And if you can't be fully authentic, then that creates shame, and it creates fear, and it creates secrecy. When there's those distinct, separate identities where we think we have to pick one, then everything in between is removed, and that hides the real us and the authentic us. And the authentic me is a nurse lecturer and a mental health patient. And I try my best to embrace all aspects of that, because ultimately none of those things define me. I am me with all of those things and many other things, and I'm enough as me with all those different aspects to me.
It's really interesting, the link between that need for authenticity and, I guess, need for acceptance. It sounds like there's a real tension there with, I mean, we all have that need for acceptance, don't we? But I guess it does manifest in different roles and different spheres of our life, doesn't it? There's a general need for acceptance, but perhaps, as a parent, you might have a need for acceptance, or as a mental health nurse, you need a need for acceptance, or as a service user, a need for acceptance. And you're being put in these different situations where there's that conflict, where to be authentic might jeopardize the acceptance.
Yeah. And we all want to be accepted as well, don't we? That's part of who we are as humans. But I do think if we're looking for evidence that we don't belong and that we're not accepted, then we'll probably always find it as well. And I think, like you say, it's about that, personal acceptance and being prepared. I'm more than prepared now to stand in that what feels like a huge gap between where nurse ends and where patient begins. But it's that kind of self-acceptance, to embrace all aspects of ourselves as one complete person. But it is hard to do that and stand in that that gap, which is another reason why I do speak about my own personal experiences. So I've got encourage other people to stand with me in that kind of authenticity and kind of embracing who we are as people.
I really enjoy the way you talk about self-disclosure and its use, and it was great reading your article that actually pointed me in the direction of another framework around self-disclosure, which I hadn't come across, which I think is Brendan Dunlop's work. But yeah, taking a look at that, and that looks really helpful. I'm not expecting you to talk about that paper, it's not your own research, but could you just share a little bit about your own tips and experience on how you use that self-disclosure with students, and maybe like some things that people maybe want to consider or even avoid when they're attempting self-disclosure for sort of therapeutic benefit with people they're working with?
I think it's important to point out that when I talk about my own personal experiences, that I'm doing that within a relatively safe environment of university, and everything that comes with that. It's the nurses that are in that Band 5 role, them navigating disclosure, is far more complex, and difficult than, me in my relatively safe environment of disclosure. But it should always be for the service users' benefit or the students' benefit, rather than, the person's benefit. So if I'm bringing in aspects of my own experience in teaching, then it's always because that's relevant to whatever we're talking about at that time, and I feel like it's going to be relevant for the students, learning, and their well-being. My personal experience of mental illness impacts who I am as a nurse and a lecturer. And it would do that whether I ever spoke publicly about it or not. So I think it's important, that students and nurses, there's no pressure to talk to anybody about it if you don't want to, or there's no pressure to talk to service users about it if you don't want to, or staff if you don't want to, or just a couple of staff, or whatever's comfortable, because that personal experience, will impact someone's practice, whether they publicly talk about it or not. And I think that's really important, for students and nurses to kind of reflect on, and think that, what they've been through is still going to be doing some good and is still going to be impacting who they are as a nurse, whether they ever tell and talk publicly about it. If they do, it should be in the benefit of the service user or the member of the staff or the student. But it does take a lot of kind of emotional intelligence, and a bit of trial and error along the way. I think support and supervision is really vital for nurses with their own lived experience, and a safe place where they can talk about how their practice is impacting on themselves, or anything that's, reminding them of themselves, or, anything like that. They really need a safe place to be able to explore that. I don't think nurses with their own lived experience or students need more support than another nurse, but I think they definitely need a different type of support, which I think definitely needs a lot of work in practice.
That kind of neatly leads on to probably, I guess, the final area that I'd love to just talk to you about is with respect to mental health nurse education. What do you see from your perspective as being some of the gaps or things that might be missing from mental health nurse curricula, and what would you like to see be included or indeed taken away from that education?
I think there is a risk in UK nurse education, that there's a move towards a more generic education, or a more generic nurse. And definitely those core mental health nursing skills definitely need more investment and more time given to, and those being recognised by the NMC as well. There's a risk that we're producing nurses who are very much task focused, but mental health nurses, they need those, advanced interpersonal skills. They need to have the skills and the confidence and the ability to simply be with someone in distress, and sit with someone in distress and have that human to human connection. Again, it was only when I became a mental health patient that I truly realised the value, of being with someone, and just sitting there with them in that distress. To someone looking on, it might not seem that there's much going on, but there's many complex, interpersonal, skills that are being used to enable someone to feel heard, to feel safe, to feel accepted, to feel hope for the future. These are all complex skills that mental health nurses need.
Yeah, that interpersonal element is just crucial, isn't it? I think it's some of these basics. There is complexity to the basics, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it was really really helpful to hear your perspective on, I guess, what you needed in those moments when you became a service user. Compassion and acceptance and being heard and understood, I imagine.
And the mental health nurses that did provide that, etched in my memory and will be, forever. But also on the flip side, more negative experiences of feeling kind of dismissed, or silenced, or not listened to, or not taken seriously. Those moments are also kind of equally as etched in my memories, sadly. So the impact of a mental health nurse is, it's profound. And I want to encourage, student nurses and mental health nurses to realize that they can have that, incredibly positive, powerful impact. And often that's not completed by, or that's not achieved by, doing a task, filling out an arbitrary care plan. It's achieved by that human to human connection, and that ability to kind of be with someone in distress.
Jane, I want to thank you so much for sharing what you shared with me today. And like I said to you before, it was a real pleasure reading your articles. In the show notes to this episode, we'll put a link to those for people to read. We didn't really specifically mention them, did we, in this conversation? But you wrote a fab article. I think, was it published this year, the Who Am I article?
Yeah, early this year, yeah.
Yeah, so that was a great article Jane wrote about all this identity stuff and your lived experience.
Yeah.
And another great article, which we haven't really touched on today, maybe we can come back to that another time, about resilience and the problematic nature of trying to make nurses more resilient. I would love to talk more about that, but yeah, perhaps we can have another conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the paper on identity was probably one of the most therapeutic papers that I've written. And I know other nurses who have mental health challenges who have read that and have found it quite helpful. So I would encourage any nurse with their own mental health challenges, maybe have a read of that and, see if it's helpful. And I'm, all for keeping in touch with people and not being the lone voice, and standing in that gap between nurse and patient. So anybody with their own lived experience, please feel free to get in touch.
Well, thanks for that offer, Jane. Well, we'll put your contact details in the show notes as well, so people can find that, where to track you down. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.